And I will call the meeting to order. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Newsma, council member from the 4th Ward. I have the pleasure this evening of hosting the August 23rd meeting of the Redistricting Committee. I will take a quick roll call here of committee members. Councilmember Burns. I show here. Councilmember Burns is present. Councilmember Nguyen.
Here.
And I, Councilmember Newsma, am present. We're expecting Councilmember Reed in just a few minutes. Our first order of business this evening is to approve the minutes of our last meeting. If somebody would like to make a motion, that was the June meeting.
I move approval of the June Redistricting Committee minutes.
Second.
It's been properly moved by Councilmember Nguyen, seconded by Councilmember Burns. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The minutes of the June meeting are approved by unanimous vote, and let the record reflect that Councilmember Reed has joined us as well. So full contingent of committee members is present, and we will continue with our discussion tonight. As I had said earlier, we are going to spend this meeting and the next several meetings going through the wards kind of one by one to consider factors that we need to keep in mind for when we do redraw the map. The intention for the meeting tonight and for the next several meetings is not to redraw the map in real time, but just take a look at, for example, tonight we're looking at wards 2 and 4. Ward 2 is a little bit big, Ward 4 is a little bit small. So as we compare those two wards with other adjoining wards, and keeping in mind our commitment to kind of keep this process simple, we're going to be thinking about the border areas of the wards and factors to consider as we eventually get to the point where we're going to be redrawing some lines here. So I would like to now share my screen to kick off the discussion here. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, do you see the presentation mode, or do you see, there we go. That might be a little bit easier for folks to see.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. So just a quick look at the big picture here. Our ward populations are out of balance. The total deviation is 20.4%. And our intent in this process is to get that number down as close to 0 as possible. By federal guidelines, it has to be below 10%, but ideally we would like that to be close to 0. And again, that's the difference percentage-wise between the largest above average ward and the smallest below average ward. That total swing needs to be as close to 0 as possible. And so factors that we are considering as we go through this process were enumerated in the ordinance in 2003. As we have discussed in previous meetings, we are not limiting ourselves to this list for this process. And so we're certainly able to take other factors into consideration in this the 2023 process here. But this list, serves as a good starting point for discussion, at least. If we want to add to this list for the ordinance that will be coming out of this process, we are certainly able to do that. And so let's now get down to brass tacks and start to have the interesting conversations that we're going to get into, starting with the 2nd ward. The 2nd ward is oversized by 5%. 2020 census shows that their population has 432 people above average, which means they are 5% above average. And if we look at the wards that border the second ward, which are 1, 4, 5, and 9, all of those wards are below average. So this is not going to be a simple solution of just shifting some population from the second ward to the 9th ward, for example, which is why we're not going to get into redrawing the map tonight, because since we're looking at just one ward at a time, it's not a holistic perspective, but it does allow us to have a reasonable conversation. Looking at the second ward demographics, the population of the second ward has increased by actually more than 10%. It's up 978 people since the 2010 census. That's total population. If we look at the demographics, the Black population is shrinking, but the number of residents who identify as 2 or more races is significantly increasing. And I will repeat at this point our commitment that we confirmed in previous committee meetings, that we intend or desire to, after we do this redistricting process, we desire to have 3 wards which are majority non-white. And so we'll keep that in mind as we go through this process as well. So here are the numbers. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like graphically. And just as a point of information here, as a point of information here, it's not as if we have some people living on the ETHS campus here. The way this map was prepared, each dot represents, I believe, 3 people. And the algorithm goes by census block. And it's the number of dots for each census block are randomized with it, geographically within that census block. So I was confused by that at first, but that makes sense if you think about it. So here's where we're at. Ward 2 is I gotta do. Hold on one second. There we go. So Ward 2 is undersized by 206 people. The bordering wards are, hold on. I skipped a slide here. There we go, second ward. Second ward is oversized by 432 people. The bordering wards are all smaller. So what I would like to do now, if it makes sense to the committee, is just to kind of go through in ward order. Like if we were going to shift some population from Ward 2 to Ward 1, what would we want to consider if we were looking in this area? Mm-hmm. And then, if we were going to shift from Ward 2 to Ward 4, what would we consider here? Does that approach make sense to everybody?
Yeah, I think it makes sense as long as we recognize that this is an exercise that's a bit in isolation.
Yes.
Obviously, if you looked at Ward 1 or Ward 3, we'd have slightly different solutions in order to keep that balance. So eventually, this is going to be a melding of all of the solutions that we're looking at.
Exactly, and that's the intent here. So we're not going to be redrawing the map in real time here, because what we do for Ward 2 is going to have a domino effect on other wards.
Right.
And in order to have a kind of cohesive conversation, we'll limit it to just for the moment, just Ward 2 and the bordering wards, and then repeat that process for the other wards. Then, once we have all that input in hand, we will then look at the whole map and draw some new lines and come up with some a map, 2 maps, maybe 3 maps that we will consider and then present to the public for additional comment.
That makes sense.
Okay. Since I'm sharing screen here, I can't see anybody else. But the intent here is to have just kind of an open conversation with committee members and members of the public as well. And so, Kina, if you could, if I could ask for your help in if people are raising their hand, or if it's a small number of community participants at this point, just feel free to jump in, and we'll do it that way if it remains manageable.
Jonathan, can I make a comment already?
Sure.
So in the area that you were just showing where the second ward is adjacent to the first ward.
Yes.
Which is downtown. It is part of our downtown.
Yeah.
I think one of the values that we have, one of the valuable aspects of our ward maps that we have right now is that there are three council members whose wards contain portions of the downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's proven over time to be a very good balance. So my concern about moving this is, this has nothing to do with whoever's on the council one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's always been valuable to have the second ward alderman council member be involved with the downtown issues, just like the first ward and the fourth ward council member had been over time. Now, I mean, if you shifted some of that to become the fifth ward, into the fifth ward, that would retain that third council member who has some portion of their ward be the downtown.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you're suggesting if it's not the second ward, then perhaps the fifth ward could have a portion of downtown.
Yeah, I mean, that's because I do think having that third voice has always proven to be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
We have a resident with their hand raised.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it sounds like Darlene.
Tina Payton.
Oh, hey, Tina.
Hi. So the area that you're discussing right now would be my house.
Okay.
And I, from years ago, the council has never addressed even that it's still called the research park. And I think you need to address that at this time also, because that is a certain area, and that area too has leaked over into the first ward as well. When you're doing this redistricting, have you figured out how it's going to affect property tax, or if somebody is currently in CDBG or a TIF area, and then you change the ward, and then that's no longer the case?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about this yet?
Yes and no. We are aware that there are other maps, like school district maps and CDBG maps and other boundaries in town that may or may not currently be contiguous with ward boundaries. But we have acknowledged in previous meetings that those kind of things are something that we will think about as we go through this process. In answer to your specific question about property taxes, whether this, just to take an example here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this block right here of the second ward north of Emerson, if that moves to the fifth ward, is that going to have any impact on their property taxes? Not to my knowledge. Would that change whether or not they're in a TIF district? No, the TIF districts have their own maps that are not impacted by the ward maps.
Well, I know that the research park is an old situation that has never been addressed,
Mhm.
since obviously it's not the research park anymore.
So
And
Tina, I'm making a note that you have suggested we consider the research park, at least be aware of that when we're going through this process. So that's exactly the kind of feedback we're looking for right now.
okay, because those have very specific guidelines, and a lot of the things aren't research park, like E2
Mhm.
and a lot of those buildings are not research park anymore.
Right, right.
And so we'll have to see how that's going to work. And then I know that I think there's a portion of Ward 1 that is that as well. But this part just past Emerson. So I thought that Maple and Emerson on the north side, I thought that was already the fifth ward. That's not by the map. So that's on, so the graduate housing building, is that the second ward?
I'm not sure exactly where that building is. But
That's on Maple.
yeah. So Tina, in order to keep this conversation on
All right,
track.
well, go ahead. I just, am very concerned when you're moving things around, how it's gonna affect the voting and taxes and everything.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Payton. So if we're looking, again, we're looking at Ward 2 compared to the first ward here. Councilmember Nguyen has made the point that it's desirable to keep downtown, to have downtown continue to be represented by 3 council members.
Council Newsom, we have another resident with their hand raised, Carlson Sutton.
Mr. Sutton? Go ahead, Mr. Sutton.
Thank you. Yeah, looking at the map, my concern is with the delineating numbers of census of Black residents. Why is the second ward extending north of Church Street in that area between the railroad tracks?
Up here.
Especially since, we already have a large population of new residents in Church Street Village that are in the second ward already. And I just don't see the benefit other than diminishing the effectiveness of the Black vote by adding that area in purple north of Church Street to the second ward, when basically I thought geographically it should remain in the fifth ward.
So you're suggesting that, can you see my mouse here?
Yes, I can.
So you're talking about this kind of.
No, he's not talking
on the
about
other
that
side.
area.
The other side. But now that's what I'm talking about right there. Okay. And if you go to Lion Street, which is a fifth ward, it stops there.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. That area there on Church Street, all the way over to Ashland. So there's Wesley and right.
Asbury, Ashland, Wesley, Asbury.
Right. That area, like I said, it's already enough new residents on Church Street Village. So basically, I would like the fifth ward boundary to extend or continuous extend down to Church Street to the south, rather than being removed to the second ward.
So that would, like, for these 3 blocks right here.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Because Lion Street on the 1700 block is already second ward.
Mhm.
And the east side of Darrow in the 1700 block, or move there over a little bit to the right there, is already in the second ward.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
our ward is split in half on Darrow Street.
yeah.
1700 block, west is fifth and second is east.
So
And I would like to have that included into the fifth ward for purposes of equal representation, since we're the only group that I see in your statistics, Blacks, that are losing population.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, I'm going to note that input. And again, we're not redrawing the map in real time here. I will say that if we made these 3 blocks here in the 5th ward,
Mhm.
that kind of cuts off this section of the 2nd ward, which is not permissible. The wards need to be contiguous
Well, contiguous to what? That's my point.
to each other. You can't have, you need to be able to get from in any place in the 2nd ward to any other place in the 2nd ward without leaving the 2nd ward.
Okay, then why can't that go into the 4th ward?
So yeah, that's a possibility,
Yeah, rather
right?
than.
We theoretically, we could drop this border down to right there,
Mhm,
theoretically.
mhm.
And so if we're kind of summarizing, you would like to see, we're jumping ahead. I was gonna, just to keep on track, go through, the borders 1, 4, 5, and 9. We're talking about the 5th ward border right now, no big deal. But you would like to see at least some of this
Remain in the 5th.
go to the 5th ward.
Well,
I think it's safe to say that because the 5th ward is already undersized,
Mhm.
anything that's currently in the 5th ward is pretty likely to remain in the 5th ward.
Okay,
Like-
then why do I see my residents being transferred to the 2nd ward?
Nobody's transferring anybody anywhere yet,
Oh, okay.
right? That's what we're talking about here.
No.
But one way of getting this Ward 2 number down from plus 432 and balancing this minus 705 in the 5th ward is to move some of these blocks here
Mhm.
into the 5th ward.
Okay, that's my recommendation. Yes, sir.
That's what your point is.
And
Yes.
Chair, I think one of the issues is somewhere it got out there that the 5th ward would be diminished. I've heard that as well. And as the chair is saying, it's the opposite. The 5th ward needs to get larger. And what Mr. Sutton said is consistent with what I said earlier on in maybe our first meeting, that there are some obvious areas, which is predominantly or really exactly what Mr. Sutton described, where the 5th ward, I think, should just naturally get bigger to make it less confusing. And he described those areas.
Yeah, that's exactly the conversation. That's the input we're looking for tonight.
And I will say, Jonathan, another thing that is confusing with the coloring of these maps is that parks are the same color as the 5th ward.
Yeah.
So that might be a little bit confusing to people when they're looking at things.
Yeah, that's a good point, Melissa. This here is not the 5th ward, that's a park.
Yeah. And that little pocket park
And-
there.
Right there.
Yeah.
That's a park. That's not the 5th ward. A little bit confusing.
Mhm.
But yeah, point taken. The challenge the committee is going to have is, if we want to maintain 2nd ward representation downtown, somehow making sure that we're not cutting off that portion of the 2nd ward from this portion of the 2nd ward. So that might mean changing the 4th ward border.
Right, or it could be that the 5th ward alderman, council member, becomes the 3rd downtown council member.
Like right, if this triangle here went to the 5th ward.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another
We have
possible
another
solution.
question. We have another question from resident Cindy Reed.
Ms. Reed, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I understand what, and I'm a little late. I was on channel 16 and it never came on. But representation downtown in the 5th and 4th ward I agree with Alderman Nguyen. I do think it's important that the second ward as well as the fifth ward have representation downtown.
Mhm.
And I think, I don't know how we are going to do it, how that can be done so that the second ward maintain representation downtown, or unless they cut into, well, you don't want to cut into the fourth ward. But, and then the other point I have is that the parks, I agree, because I didn't know what the other green things were, or the little
Mhm.
marks were. Maybe the park should be a different color. And the third thing I would say is that we do not have an alderman right now,
Yep.
and in the second ward. So I feel that the representation for the second ward is not represented fairly in this meeting, because our alderman, we do not have a councilman yet.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
I don't know why this meeting was not canceled until that decision is made.
the timing was unfortunate, and we laid out the schedule before we knew that there was going to be a vacancy. But just to explain the process here, we're going to take the next several months to have conversations like this for all of the wards. And then the committee is going to take the feedback and draw several potential maps with the feedback that we've received. And we will share those maps with the public and then receive some public input on these proposed maps. And this takes us through early next year. And it's not going to be until May of next year that this committee formally makes a recommendation to City Council. And so that leaves us more than enough time for the second ward vacancy to be filled, and for us to receive some input from whoever our new colleague is going to be in the second ward.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Council Chair, if I can jump in, I want just thank you for that great explanation. But I do also just want to acknowledge that to Ms. Reed, that I'll apologize that I didn't think of that. Given that we are going to be doing this process over the next several months, we probably should have held off on this meeting until later in the year, later September or early November, in order to ensure that there was a representative in the second ward in place when this meeting took effect. But there will be greater opportunity, as Councilman Bernusma said. I also want to just point out, as we're discussing redrawing the maps, and particularly what downtown may look like and how that may be divvied up. I wonder, how, given our equity lens and our understanding of downtown as the economic core of the city, and the history of downtown maybe not being the most welcoming place to folks of color, what if the second ward and fifth ward both had representation downtown? And maybe because the first ward needs to shrink, and I know Claire wouldn't be the happiest about this.
First word needs to grow.
I'm sorry. Okay,
yeah.
And the fourth ward also needs to grow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, even so, we can move the boundaries a bit, but thinking about both of those wards, the potential of that, I think, could really shift some dynamics in the city, and put us in a stronger place with achieving our equity goals and making the city more inviting for all.
Okay, I'm taking minutes for this meeting, so I'm writing down all the comments as we go through them here. Let's.
And Chair, I have one comment, and again, I have I really see value in all the comments people are making, but this is just a note that one thing about the second ward is they have two, maybe three, but I know two pretty large commercial areas or business areas. Think about Dempster and Dodge and along Main Street. And I think it makes sense to continue to have the second ward downtown, but I think if we had to choose between 3 or 4, especially in trying to keep wards contiguous, that's just something to keep in mind, that the second ward does have quite a bit of businesses and business districts to represent.
So you're suggesting that if Ward 2 hypothetically lost downtown, they would still have business areas within their boundaries.
Yeah, I'm just saying if it came to a point where we have to choose, because that's a small area over there, and so the wards would have to get really narrow and thin at certain points to make some of what I'm hearing possible. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Again, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Right, that's a good point. And to Ms. Reed's point, you know, it's unfortunate that we don't have a council member representing the second ward, since we're essentially kind of kicking off this conversation, this whole process, by talking about the one ward that doesn't currently have a council member, but woulda, coulda, shoulda. Make a note.
And we could move to the 27th. I don't know if someone.
Yeah, you know what, we have time to readdress this later. It's on the agenda for this evening. Let's have the conversation now. We can always pick it up again later.
And there's nothing stopping us from doing 2 and 5, doing 2 again on the 27th if need be. So I just want to put that out there, because I think in a lot of ways 2 and 5, it would have made sense for those 2 to go together anyway. So
it might have,
we might want to revisit it on the 27th.
That's a good point.
Of next month.
All right, so let's keep cruising through the list here. We've talked about Ward 2 when it compares to Ward 1 and 5. Let's talk about Ward 2 compared to in Ward 4 and this border here, which has always kind of bugged me that it's kind of zigzagging like this. And so I'll just put it out there that I wouldn't mind if somehow this border is just straightened out and rationalized a little bit, just to make it cleaner and neater.
That makes sense. It's always confusing for people to to cross the street and discover that they're in another ward, or especially like that block in particular is that block in the second ward there.
Yeah, these ones right here are confusing.
Yeah, I mean, you've got kind of islands on either side.
Yeah.
Councilmember Newsome, we have another resident with her hand raised.
Sure, go ahead. Who is that?
T is what it says.
That sounds like Tina.
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead, Ms. Baden.
Do you know the numbers? So the population of the areas that you're talking about? If you're trying to move certain blocks, do you know how many numbers that is?
We do. That's not the level of detail I wanted to get in tonight.
Okay.
But we do, yes, we absolutely do know that. We can't have this conversation. We can't finalize the map without knowing block by block what the numbers are. We do have those numbers.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know like how much, like let's say Carlos was talking about here at Church in Ashland and Wesley.
Right.
How many people is that adding to the 5th ward?
Right. If we moved this whole chunk of purple and made it green, what would that do to the numbers?
Yeah, but
we're not going to answer that right now, but like that's part of the process. Tina, I think you took care of that. Or was that Luke? Thank you. I think.
Yeah, I turned off screen sharing.
Okay. I apologize for that rude interruption, but thank you, Luke, for taking care of that. If I'm sorry, let's mute that person as well. Apologies for that rude and inappropriate and offensive interruption, everybody. Thank you, Luke and Kina, for managing that. If it's all right with everybody, we'll just go ahead and proceed.
Yeah, I just want to make a note that never had these issues on Google. And so I would you know, I don't know if City Manager Stowe is online, but I almost feel we should fully switch to Google Meet. I think for whatever reason, it seems like it's much easier to safeguard from these type of situations. So
Are you
just putting that note in.
Are you suggesting we do that for next time, or you want
For
to
next-
start over for?
I don't know
this
if there's a
meeting?
way to, if it makes sense to do it for this meeting. We'll see what happens, but certainly for future meetings. And I don't know if City Manager still agrees, but I've the Fifth Ward meetings have been meetings that I've been on have been Zoom bombed a lot, but since we switched to only Google Meet, we haven't dealt with it. So I don't know what that means. City Manager Stowe can speak to it better than I
Okay.
can. But
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Burns. And again, apologies for the inappropriate and offensive interruption to our civil discussion here. So back on track, if I could, if Luke or Keen, if you could allow me to share my screen again, we'll continue talking about the 2nd and 4th Ward border.
Go ahead, Councilmember.
Okay, sharing. All right, there we go. All right, so yeah, if we're going to clean up this border, it sounds like there is not any objection to just kind of smoothing that line out if that's what it takes to balance the numbers and kind of clean up the map. I'm curious, Councilmember Nguyen, if you know why Robert Crown is in the 4th Ward rather than the 2nd Ward. Because geographically, it would just be a little bit cleaner if this whole block were in the 2nd Ward. Councilmember Nguyen is muted. And I'm not sure actually that would have any effect on the numbers because they're a limited population in that census block.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think actually, believe it or not, the 2nd and 4th Ward, I think if you go back and look at the prior map,
Yeah,
it was like a staircase down.
yeah, two times. Yeah, 2nd and 4th Ward have moved from like an east-west orientation 2 maps ago. And then the previous map to this one was kind of a stair step. And it's kind of shifting from an east-west to a north-south orientation as history unfolds here.
And so I think that in that stair step, Robert Crown was somewhere in that stair step and that had been traditionally in the 4th Ward.
Okay.
And then remained in the 4th Ward because the 4th Ward alderman at the time, Steve Bernstein, had been working very much on figuring out a rebuilding or replacement of the Robert Crown Recreation Center. But you'd have to get him on the phone to have him, and Lionel, to get Steve and Lionel on the phone.
And we don't need to be constrained by the history of city politics 30 years ago.
Right. But I think that's why it used to be surrounded by the 4th Ward, and now and actually for the purposes of Robert Crown, it's the community around there really doesn't pay much attention to what ward they're in. They when they have Robert Crown issues.
Yeah, so honestly, that might be an argument for putting Robert Crown in the 2nd Ward, since most of the surrounding neighbors, at least with the current map, are 2nd Ward residents.
That's right.
Although that, it's not going to change the numbers much. So there is
it doesn't really help the 9th Ward a lot.
Yeah, and it doesn't help the 9th Ward. But let's talk about this border here between the 2nd and 9th. And 9th is going to have to get a lot bigger. And the way it's going to work out is probably a lot of that is going to come from the 2nd Ward. And so we're going to have a separate meeting to talk about the 9th Ward, which is probably the more appropriate time to talk about which of these blocks, the 9th Ward might want to hold on to, if any. But I anticipate as this process unfolds that a lot of this territory down here is going to be shifted from the 9th ward to the 2nd ward.
Well, that would make some sense because it's all south of Main Street, and Main Street is a major thoroughfare. and
Yeah.
so that acts as a natural physical boundary
Yeah.
between one community and another. A main thoroughfare does.
Yeah. So we'll have more to say on that topic when we are talking specifically about the 9th ward.
Yeah.
Okay. We've had a really good, productive, and for the most part civil, with the exception of our Zoom bombing, a good conversation here about the 2nd ward. Before we move on to a focus on the 4th ward, is there anything else that anybody wants to add about the 2nd ward?
This is Cindy Reed. I have my hand up.
Go ahead, Ms. Reed.
The 9th ward,
Mhm.
it starts at Washington.
Mhm.
And we talked about the shopping centers, I think, over in the 2nd ward. I also want to make mention, I think on Howard Street, there's a shopping center as well.
Mhm.
And we want to keep that in mind. I think we have three shopping centers.
Okay.
And I think on Howard Street, that we have Jewel's and other stores over there.
Yeah. Okay. Make a note of that as well. All right, I'm going to move on to the 4th ward then, and we'll have a similar conversation about the 4th ward. And what we're looking at here is a ward that is undersized by 2.4%, a total of 206 people, which hasn't really changed much in the last 10 years. Despite the fact that the 4th ward population has increased, we are still undersized by 2.5%, just over 200 people. The 4th ward has lost white population, gained a small number of Black Evanstonians, and as with the 2nd ward, we have gained significantly a number of residents who identify with 2 or more races. And we have added some Hispanic population as well. So those are the numbers here. That's what it looks like graphically. No surprises there really, but let's talk about now how we can make the 4th ward larger. And again, we will go through this, kind of in numerical order of bordering wards. Give me a second while I make some notes here. So if we're talking about downtown, 4th ward and 1st ward, I agree with Councilmember Wynn that we should have at least 3 wards representing downtown. And I, as the council member for the 4th ward, I do enjoy and appreciate representing a portion of downtown. Having said that, I'm not necessarily married to this particular arrangement, which strikes me as a little bit odd. And if all we're doing is drawing shapes that are as simple as possible, we might want to consider moving, putting this block and maybe this block into the 4th ward, and maybe giving this block to the 1st ward if we needed to do that. Which I wouldn't be opposed to. I think that's something worth considering. Does anybody have any thoughts on the matter? Any committee members or community members?
May I say something with regard to that?
Oh, is that Councilmember Kelly?
Yeah, hi.
Please. Hey, Claire, how are you?
Good, thank you. So the only thing I see with that is that if you remove that block of the Davis to Church, but then you add that little strip, we still end up with kind of a contorted, like it seems to me either just I mean, why would you remove, it just seems like we're still ending up with sort of a contorted figuration.
Yeah, the idea would be to make it less contorted, but we're not going to end up with perfect squares here.
Right, but I wouldn't then remove your Davis. I mean, it just seems like if we're looking at that, you would just fill that in. And obviously we're then going to need to shift first ward more into Northwestern or more into the 7th ward. But
Yeah,
I wouldn't say, it just seems to me, I mean, I don't really, for me, I don't have any personal preference, but if you're looking to kind of block it out more, it would just be to fill in that area between
to fill in this area, make this
Correct.
4th ward and keep this area.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like that would make more sense.
Yeah.
yeah, Jonathan, Claire, I agree with you. I think that it right now it looks sort of like a pizza slice there.
Yeah,
And it actually would make more sense not to have that, but to actually have it be contiguous. And I think there are other ways to shift population from and we've discussed this many times, from the 3rd ward into the 1st ward, so that the 1st ward, the 2nd ward, and whatever the 3rd ward, whatever 2nd or 5th ward represent the downtown.
mhm,
So that's not jeopardized by dividing up the downtown pie
yeah,
to, you
Yeah.
know, so that you want to, am I making myself clear? It's the idea of holding on, making sure that we have those 3 different council members represent portions of the downtown,
mhm,
and yet still being able to appropriately balance. I think there are ways to appropriately balance the 1st ward without necessarily taking from the 2nd ward or the 4th ward, certainly.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
But I mean, I would say alternatively, it would be just, or to relinquish that kind of funny block that sticks out, that
Mhm.
date right there, to relinquish that to the 1st. And again, we see that boundaries do traverse the lines, the train lines. So
Yeah.
that's not, so we can look at that in terms of the 4th into the 3rd that exceeds, where you could actually take perhaps some of the 3rd ward also. I mean, 4th ward already occupies, does have, as exists, a large portion of downtown.
Yeah.
So I would say to consider that too, either
Yeah.
relinquishing that little funny chunk of Davis into the 1st ward, or but not to sort of just, to Melissa's point, either take, bring that whole border over,
yeah.
extend
I
it, or remove that little Davis block.
Yeah.
into the
It would, I mean, it would make, if the numbers made sense to essentially, if you can see my mouse, to trade this block for this block, that would clean up the map.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the numbers, what impact that has of the numbers, not the point of tonight.
Yeah,
And
it might not be enough, Jonathan.
yeah.
But you
And,
can also
and,
expand
well,
over
both
the
first and 4th ward are undersized. So,
Right.
we need to be moving population to both of those wards. And
Right.
it's not part of our agenda for this evening, but as long as we're talking about the 1st ward, it's probably going to be fairly likely that this section of the 3rd ward here gets shifted probably to the 1st ward.
Or to the 4th ward.
Or
You
to the
could
4th
also
ward, yeah.
extend over the tracks, just the
Yeah,
way.
like the
happened.
4th ward could go here too.
That seems like that might make sense, to just have the 4th ward follow that line from Grove to Lake and continue down along Chicago Avenue there.
Mhm.
Um,
There's-
I-
Yeah, it might make sense. I mean, my takeaway here is that the council members currently representing these wards are expressing a willingness to draw a map that makes sense for everybody, and we're not feeling particularly territorial about anything.
Correct.
We have another resident with her hand raised, resident Deborah Jetzer.
Miss Jetzer,
Hi, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, I live in Ward 1. Hi, Claire. And just to point out, the yellow on Davis and Sherman that you're pointing to is actually Sherman Plaza with 250 units. I think it's over 300 people. So
Mhm.
it's a big chunk to
Yeah.
be moving. The
Yeah.
other comment I had was Fountain Square. with the map currently, it's divided down
Mhm.
Davis. So two council members represent Fountain Square right now.
Mhm.
Just wondering to consider, is that a good idea as far as planning purposes and things that happen in discussions for Fountain Square? Is it better to have just one council member represent Fountain Square? And
That's a good question. I think to Councilmember Wynn's point, like having multiple council members represent downtown gives downtown a little bit more sway.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I would like, actually, if it could be a pie, I'd love all 9 members to have a little bit of say, and because there's so much that needs to go on
Yeah.
downtown.
Yeah, and so on that same note, having Fountain Square represented by 2 different council members, does give Fountain Square a little bit more say. Claire, what do you think?
I agree. No, I agree. I think it's nice that we share it. I think we collaborate and there's a synergistic impact of being able to work together on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree. If circumstances necessitated all of Fountain Square going to one or the other ward, if that's what it takes, then so be it. But I'm not opposed to keeping Fountain Square split as it is currently.
Correct. But Deb, thank you for pointing out the Sherman Plaza building. That is very important because that does represent a large number of residents.
Right, and like explicitly, we're not getting into the numbers tonight. Otherwise, the conversation would get way too deep. But that's the kind of thing we're going to have to take into account when we start drawing the maps and trying to balance numbers.
Right, and it wasn't meant to be a preference for which ward. It was just that's a big chunk of people to be shifting
Exactly.
numbers.
Exactly.
And Ward 1 is under. So yeah, I think it's worth looking at traversing the rails there for 4th into 3rd.
Okay, making some notes here. All right, so looking at, we talked about the border between Ward 4 and Ward 2 earlier this evening when we were focused on Ward 2, so we don't need to repeat that conversation. If we are looking at the border between the 4th Ward and the 3rd Ward, to pick up and just to reiterate what we said a few minutes ago, the possibility of maybe some of these blocks here east of Chicago being moved from the 3rd to the 4th would, if that makes sense, that wouldn't be a terrible idea.
And Jonathan, they were previously in the 4th Ward. That's the slice just south of Lake Street, Lake down to, what is it, Greenwood down to Dempster, west of Chicago Avenue. That was 4th Ward. So instead of I call this the panhandle of the 3rd Ward. It actually used to be more of a top hat.
Okay, because
So,
this,
yeah, and actually that is fairly dense multifamily housing right there. And so that I don't think it's, yes, the railroad tracks do present a little bit more of a boundary, but in that area, the railroad tracks don't present as big a boundary as further south. It's paired right along Chicago Avenue. And so that to me makes a lot of sense to shift that back, because there is a lot of there's a lot of crossover from one side to the other. And then that would get you back the 206 pretty quickly.
Yeah, that might do it right there. But because of all the other dominoes that are falling, it's probably not going to be quite that simple.
No, I mean, I will say that panhandle is very handy for both the 4th Ward and actually for the 1st Ward in terms of adding a lot of density, a lot
Yeah.
of people into both the fourth ward, and a portion of that could go into the first ward.
Yeah, so it's, you know, likely that this whole panhandle here is gonna no longer be in the third ward.
I know, I'm very sad about it. I know a lot of people who live there, but I'm really committed to the idea that this be a simple change in the map.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
And I just want to say, I also think that that makes sense. I think we do have to look a little bit in terms of geography and creating communities for wards. I think that is important. So, I mean, I think first does kind of do this crazy sort of stretch really far south, which I love. But I think that does make sense to keep that sort of block of the fourth ward together by picking up that Lake Street to, Melissa, did you say it went all the way to?
It was just that little sliver that Jonathan is outlining,
I
right?
see. Okay. It was that. Got
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised in the past if even further back it was more than that.
Mhm.
But it was that little sliver.
Mhm. Yeah, and it seems like that would be a natural geographic continuation.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Oh,
rather
it
than,
is.
rather than
Yeah.
the tracks, the border kind of shifts to Chicago, which is still a, you know,
Right, yeah, I mean,
a
it goes
man-made
from,
geographical boundary.
right, it's a very nice, that boundary is not that, it's a very porous one there,
Yeah.
because it's not along a busy road along with it.
Okay, so let's talk about fourth ward and the ninth ward. Both of which are undersized, but the ninth ward much more significantly so. So theoretically, if the fourth ward picks up some population from up here somewhere, that puts us in the green, you know, we might have some territory to cede to the ninth ward down here. I will say that I do enjoy representing the businesses on both sides of Main Street here. You know, it's a cohesive business community.
Very,
But it does feel a little bit weird for the residents down here in Washington that they're not part of the ninth ward. And so we'll have this conversation with Councilmember Hadakaris when the ninth ward comes up on the agenda. But
And what about fourth ward extending even further on the east side of the tracks into the third ward, since the third ward is so overrepresented?
well, that's what we're just talking about. Like,
Right, but I mean,
between-
as opposed to taking, I mean, what about, I'm sorry, I mean, the ninth ward, what about the fourth ward extending, but then the ninth ward also extending, pardon me, ward also extending to the east side of the tracks?
Let's talk about that in detail when the ninth ward comes up on our committee agenda. But I think Melissa made the point that closer to downtown, the tracks are more porous of a boundary than they are down here.
yeah, I mean, further, in that area, Claire, you've got two sets of tracks and Chicago Avenue. And so the neighborhood is not, you would not consider it a contiguous neighborhood from one side of the tracks, because it's two sets of tracks and across Chicago Avenue. So unlike further north where it's only one set of tracks, that feels like you're really trying to bring two very different entities together. And I think there are other solutions to the ninth ward that are really maintain neighborhoods and communities.
And I just want to say, I understand the compromise closer to downtown, but I think these type of structures are really good opportunities to provide clarity to voters. And if we really want to encourage people to understand their ward boundaries a lot more and relate to them, I think, you know, continuing to have that track be a dividing line is important.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. but getting back to the ward in question, if we're talking 4th Ward, 9th Ward, there is an alley that doesn't show up on the map here. So theoretically, we could draw the ward boundary on the, oh, at least right here, there's an alley. So for the most part, ward boundaries are on streets rather than alleys. But maybe this is a conversation for the when the 9th Ward is in the meeting. But if these residents on Washington Street wanted to move to the 9th Ward, that would make sense to me. But I do like representing all of the business district here on Main Street.
Yeah, I would say I agree with that, Jonathan, in the sense of you and I both represent, excuse me, that the main dumpster mile, and I think it is really important to have two voices on that. And I think splintering it to a third makes it a little bit more confusing to the merchants, but also having two of us represent the main dumpster mile is really important.
Yeah.
And that is, that's people, when they're walking along that Main Street corridor, they have no idea they've crossed underneath. They may, what they're focused on the business district is the business corridor.
Exactly.
Residents think of things very differently.
Right. And these, right here, it's businesses, but in Washington, it's residences. The residents like kind of more logically fit in the 9th Ward, but the businesses fit in the 4th Ward. So that's a bit of a challenge there.
Yeah.
All right. Is anything else that anybody wants to add with regards to the 4th Ward?
Resident Cindy Reed has her hand raised.
Ms. Reed? Ms. Reed, if you're muted, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Okay, there we go.
I guess I'm a little confused. I'm trying to understand how Ward 3 is at such a high number and how did that happen in the first place? But also we have to remember that I think Vogue, if I'm not mistaken, that building over on Main Street, that is going to be a major hub, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if they're building apartments down on top of that or what. I don't have the details about that. But also I wanted to say that since I don't quite understand this, and I hear what you're saying, I would like to know at some point the impact in making these changes. What are the impacts to the residents from an education perspective, funding perspective, and representation? And where would we eventually see that information?
Just the best place to follow this redistricting conversation is on the city's webpage. The city's website, there's a webpage for the redistricting committee. And hold on, I'm going to stop sharing here. And as far as representation, what we're talking about here is only for city council. For the 9 wards of the city council represented by the 9 council members, we need to balance the numbers so that we all represent as close to the same number of people as possible. That's the overriding objective here. As far as schools and school boundaries, what we're doing here has no impact on that whatsoever. To the extent that if we have a choice of drawing a border here or drawing a border here, and a ward border here or here, and one aligns with a school attendance boundary, that would, to me, kind of make sense to keep it simple like that if we could. And that's one of the things that we kind of agreed that we would kind of keep in the back of our minds as we draw this map. But whatever we decide in terms of the ward boundaries has no impact for the school districts. And the school districts can redraw the school attendance boundaries at any time depending on what their needs are as well. So, yeah, we're not going to try and get overly collaborative with the school district in drawing our ward boundaries. That just doesn't make sense. And you made a good point about Ward 3 being kind of out of whack now, and why is that? I'll let Councilmember Nguyen address that.
Well, I think most of the, I think the reason is that the number of condo buildings that have been built in the third ward over the last
Now 20 years.
20 years, and the growth in the residents, along Chicago Avenue, which before this wasn't a residential corridor at all. And I was surprised that the number was that much higher, but I mean, we have had a lot of large number of buildings, and we also have more families living in the ward than we had before. For a long time, we were kind of pre-nesters and empty nesters.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Nguyen.
Yeah, and Ms. Reed, you also made a good point about the Vogue building, and that is going to be a residential building, probably small families, singles and couples for the most part. And so should we be thinking about that as we draw this map? Yeah, my answer is it's something we can kind of be aware of, but we are constrained by the numbers that were given to us by the 2020 census. So we can't draw a map based on anticipated growth and not knowing what those numbers are going to be, but it's something we can, kind of keep in the back of our minds. And if we can kind of future-proof this map by being thoughtful about, where we know new developments are going to come in, that's the kind of thing we can think about. But we do need to make the numbers work based on the 2020 census. And if we get that total deviation down fairly close to zero, I think that in and of itself is future-proofing us. And if we do this job right, we hopefully will not have to redistrict in 10 years because the population will still be fairly similar. But yeah, find me in 10 years and see if that theory still holds. I see two hands up, Councilmember Kelly and Ms. Payton.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I'll, if Ms. Payton wants to go first, I'll go after Ms. Payton. I think her hand went up before mine.
Okay.
Well, I was just gonna say that I didn't hear in first ward if you considered the Link 2 and the Hack building. Those are coming up. Those are fairly large projects. I'm not sure if you decided what happened on Chicago Avenue in the 1600 block. I don't know about that, but I didn't follow that project, but I know they had come up again. So I don't know if you passed it or whatever, but I do know that those projects that the Hack building is 16 stories, and the Link 2 building is 200 and something units too.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
you need to also follow the projects that have been approved already and count, at least, even if you counted one person per unit, you should have to count those too.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I think that makes sense to kind of keep in the back of our mind. But the numbers we're obligated legally to follow are the 2020 census numbers. And so we know that there are going to be new developments that increase those numbers. Nonetheless, we're obligated to follow the 2020 census numbers and bring that total deviation down to zero. Now, what your suggestion is here is if we know that there's going to be a new development, or there has been a new development since the 2020 census, that looking ahead to 10 years, if we want to potentially keep the process simple 10 years from now and maybe make one ward a little bit smaller than the 2020 census numbers show, because we know the population in 10 years is going to be greater. That's something we can think about, but it's not, those aren't the numbers that we're legally obligated to follow.
Well, but so you're discussing sometime next year, but these projects have been already approved in different areas, and they potentially may, by the time you make a decision on the map, they're getting ready to open.
Yep.
So,
I can respond a little bit to that.
okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, for one thing, the link to is currently not going forward, but I think Ms. Payton's point is really important that we keep that in mind, because we don't have to have all wards exactly equal. So when we're looking at a little bit of leeway between numbers, yes, downtown wards where there are planned developments that we know have been approved and are going up, we should absolutely keep those in mind. I mean, we can't disregard that. But the link to looks like it will not be going forward. But the housing authority building next to the Perlman on Sherman Avenue there at 1900, that most likely will. So that is something to keep in mind. Agree.
Yeah. And so and I agree that we can keep this in mind, but we don't know what the numbers are. We can't predict what future developments might happen in 8 or 9 years. And what we're doing now is actually forward-looking 10 years down the road when the 2030 census comes in.
Right.
And, what we're suggesting is that if we do a perfect job this year, we won't have to redistrict in 10 years.
Right, as close as we can get.
Yeah.
No, agree.
And so let's think about it, but the numbers that we're obligated to balance are the 2020 census
The existing numbers, right?
Yeah.
Got. And then my question was, at any point, or do we do a demographic overlay so that we can consider income and ethnicity? Have we already, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to attend the other meetings, but have we done that already so that we're looking
yes.
Okay.
Ethnicity, race and ethnicity for sure. We haven't broken it down.
And how about economic?
We haven't
Income?
broken it down economically.
So I think the income is really important, that we see how, how income is dispersed throughout the wards. I think that's really a very important component as we look at how wards are composed and where they're composed and how we redistrict.
We have another question from a resident, Kathy Hayes.
Yeah, I see Kathy Hayes, and then Cindy Reed had your hand up and it just went off, but Ms. Hayes.
Hi, thank you so much. Could you please express to me what is the legal variance that these numbers must be at? I think Alderman, Councilmember Kelly, and your statements are very valid in as far as economics and income and so forth. But what are the legal parameters where you can come, how close to the numbers can you come to make them more
let me
balanced?
And
I guess
can you see my screen? Let me answer
yes,
that.
I see many things.
Okay. All right. So you have it.
Councilmember Newsom, before you answer this question, I also want you to answer it from the lens of, I thought you said in the beginning that legally we're not, there's nothing requiring us to do anything, that we've decided to take this on because we, from a local standpoint, we believe it's important to try to get these numbers a lot closer than they are. But please answer it within the context of that, because I'm a little confused now that you're saying we're legally obligated to do certain things.
Well, state law, this goes back, for anyone who wants a deep dive on this, I'll refer you to the town hall. I believe a recording of the redistricting town hall has been posted, and we go into a deep dive. But technically state law does not require us to redistrict because our total population hasn't shifted enough to require redistricting. However, federal guidance does indicate that we should redistrict, and that federal guidance is this percent swing here. We're talking about the total population deviation, which means you look at the largest ward by population, which is in this case 11.7% above average, the third ward, And the smallest ward by population, in our case, the 9th ward, which is 8.7% below average, that gives us a total swing or total population deviation of 20.4%. And federal case law provides some guidance that says anything less than 10% is considered to be one person, one vote compliant. Anything up to 16.4% can be considered one person, one vote compliant or constitutionally compliant if there is a good reason to do so. We're at 20.4%. And so according to federal guidelines, we are out of whack and therefore should be redistricting. Even though technically the state law doesn't say that we have to, the state law allows us to do this based on the federal guidance. And so our intent here, as confirmed by this committee in previous meetings, is to get this number down from 20.4% as close to zero as we can. Okay.
And secondly, my second question is in regards to the 9th ward. The suggestions that you made, would that be the alley all the way up to the 2nd ward, in which the 9th ward would remain primarily residential and not have any of the business district whatsoever?
I guess the suggestion I was floating would be to keep these residences on the residents on Washington Street, which are currently in the 4th ward, if we could move them to the 9th ward, but keep the businesses on Main Street in the 4th ward. That was the suggestion. Like, and we're not, again, we're not redrawing the map or making any definitive decisions tonight. We're just examining possibilities. And once we have gone through this process for each ward individually, then the committee will have some work to do, and I'm sure we're going to get some headaches as we go through that process.
I'm sure, but it would definitely still make the 9th ward primarily residential with no business entity.
Thank you. You're welcome. Okay. Councilmember Kelly.
So I just want to point out that if you take the ward that's way under the 9th and the ward that's over the 3rd, really it's those two wards that if we could resolve those two wards alone, we'd be done. And that's where I know you don't, everyone's seems opposed to jumping over the tracks for the 9th ward, but that would incorporate then more business district. And this whole situation would be resolved because we would then reduce our numbers, down to what is, I'm just saying that's one way that this could be approached, where you address that which is the most under and that which is the most over, bringing those numbers closer.
I think if we did something like that, I think we could probably fairly quickly get that total deviation down to below 10, but it would not be close to 0.
And also, Claire, it violates, you haven't been in our prior meetings where we've discussed the principles that we have established of maintaining neighborhood contiguity and recognizing natural borders and not disturbing well-established areas of wards. And those are things that we've been discussing all along. And I think that it is possible to get down to as close to 0 as Jonathan's been discussing, as we have been discussing in all of our meetings, without jumping the tracks like that. The 3rd ward has a very strong sense of itself as a ward east of the tracks, and jumping over the tracks and crossing Chicago Avenue really in the bottom 1/3 of the ward, it really is really going to disrupt things. And I would be very strongly opposed to that. There are other better ways to do this.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Understood. I understand. And I'm sorry, I had a ton of, but I guess I was just thinking in terms of, to our points about sharing business districts and the strength of that it seemed like that could be beneficial, but understood. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see anybody else with a hand raised. So before we.
Yeah, I did have one last clarifying question.
Go ahead, Councilmember Burns, and then Ms. Payton one last time.
Oh, Ms. Payton, I think, was before me, so I'll go after Ms. Payton. I think she was supposed to talk after Councilmember Kelly, if I remember that correctly.
Go ahead, Tina.
Hi, I just wanted to say that this is going to affect voting. And I thought also that this committee was going to talk about putting equity as far as race and into the map. So I see, like, I don't know if you want to put the map back up, but like the 5th and 6th ward, you could take some people out of the 6th ward. It's 3.3, and take some people out of the 7th ward and put it in the 5th ward. Because those.
Right, we could do things, we could do that, we could do that, and we may end up doing that.
Well, so
right,
my comment is, because of this, I will say, I don't know if, okay, so in general, you see the 6th ward has a lot of white people and not mostly anything else. So if you're talking about fair and equitable, then put the white people, 6th ward, and combine it with the 5th ward. And same with the 7th ward. It's positive also. And so move some of the 5th ward that way too, because you're discussing, because what's gonna ultimately happen here is that this is gonna affect voting and everything else. And you're talking about doing this to be fair and equitable. But as you see from your own chart, there's not too many Black people or other ethnic groups in the 6th and 7th ward. And if they have positive numbers, then the 5th ward is right there. Then you need to put some 6th and 7th ward combined with the 5th ward and stop going to other wards. Then you can take the 2nd ward and put some in the 4th ward, and then put some in the 9th ward. So let's talk about the 6th and 7th ward combining with the 5th ward.
Right. And we're going to address each ward in turn when it comes up on our agenda. But I will repeat what I believe I said earlier, is that in previous meetings of this committee, we have expressed the intent that we will continue to have 3 wards that are majority non-white. Based on the 2020 census numbers. So our new map, we are going to be drawing that with that in mind and looking at that as an objective. I'd like to wrap up here fairly quickly, and we have one item of business to discuss. So Councilmember Burns, I'll go to you.
I can take my question offline just for the sake of having a short meeting.
Okay. In that case, the one item of business I wanted to discuss with council members is the date for our December meeting. If we met on the 4th Tuesday of December, that would put us at December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, which might not be the best time for everybody.
We're going to get such high turnout, John.
Yeah, and community members as well as committee members. So I'm going to
January.
I'm going to suggest, and that actually this would be, according to our new schedule, the 1st ward and the 3rd ward are going to be on the December on the
Claire,
December
Claire,
agenda.
what do you think about January?
Yeah, I think January is much better. I think December 27th during all the holidays and New Year's Eve is not really an appropriate
Well,
time.
in order to keep us on track, though, I'd like to not get too far behind. Could we consider earlier in December?
Or 2 in January.
2 in January is going to be tough for me because I'm going to be gone the first week of January. And
So Jonathan, what about the third Tuesday in December? Do we have?
December
any?
20th? I don't have anything on my calendar. Let me check the city calendar.
Not ideal, but. Because the second Tuesday is finance and budget.
Yeah. So if we're talking about Tuesday, the 20th, there's a Housing and Community Development Committee meeting that evening. So that's probably not good. But the 21st, that Wednesday,
Is there anything, that's not economic development, is it?
there's nothing on the calendar at this point.
Personally, I think avoiding that sort of period of time, but I mean, that's fine. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I would say even if it's 2 in 2 weeks, there's not, there's not like we're reading lots of packets beforehand. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with scheduling 2 in January during a 2-week period of time.
Looking at the city website, our January calendar doesn't go out quite as far to January. So we would have our regular meeting on the 24th. We could do something the week of the 9th, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
That
I mean,
sounds,
I think that's better than
Okay.
crowding it into that week of starting December 20th when
Okay.
everybody's orbits are beginning to decay.
And we still may be in the throes of a budget discussion at that point too. Hopefully
Well,
not.
God, please, God, no. Please, God, no.
Okay, so let's look at the week of Monday, the 9th. And the calendar doesn't go out that far, so I will just, Tuesday, the 10th, if it works.
Yeah.
yeah, that sounds good.
That sounds good. Yep.
Okay, so Tuesday, January 10th. Okay, so no December meeting. We will pencil in for now, January 10th.
Okay.
And that's in addition to our standard meeting on the 24th.
All right. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Okay,
Thanks, Jonathan.
there being no further business before the committee, I will declare this meeting adjourned, and thank you all very much for your participation.
Okay. Good night,
All right.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Night, everyone. Thank you.